So this video idea might be a little confusing based on the title. So to clarify a bit, I'll be covering things that were added to the game after vanilla WoW, but then removed from the game either during or before Legion, which is the current expansion as of making this video. Number 1, Reforging. Reforging was a feature added in Cataclysm and removed before Warlords of Draenor. What Reforging did was allow you to take a little bit of one of your secondary stats. I think it was about 40% of that stat, and then convert it into whatever other secondary stat you wanted, as long as it wasn't already on that piece of gear. So say you had haste and crit on a piece of gear, but your spec really likes mastery. You could reforge that haste or crit into mastery to suit your gear more to your taste. Sounds pretty great, right? Well, it was, and I still kinda miss it, but it did have its flaws as well. You see, around the time Reforging was in the game, players still had the hit stat. Casters needed 16% hit to never miss bosses with spells, and physical DPS needed 8%, and any hit after the hit cap was considered a dead stat. So Reforging was all about hitting the hit cap as close as possible, and then reforging everything else into your best stat. But hit chance was a little bit more complicated than that. Dual wielding hit cap was at 27%. Rogues had to hit the spell hit cap of 16% because their poisons were considered spells for some reason. All classes and specs had random buffs or talents that gave increases to hit chance. And Alliance players had to reforge their gear around whether or not they'd have a Draenei in their raid group, because their racial gave everyone in the raid 1% extra hit. So really, the problem with the reforging was hit chance, and that's not even going into expertise and spell haste caps as well. According to Blizzard, the original intent behind reforging was to offer a way for players to customize their gear, but in practice it offered little in the way of true choice. Players attempting to optimize every piece of gear were well advised to look up how they were supposed to reforge an item in an online guide or tool that had already determined the optimal choice. It added yet another step to the list of things that must be done to a new item before it was ready to be equipped, reducing the joy of getting an upgrade into a chore. If an upgrade drops, you want you to be able to equip it with a minimum of fuss. It is for those reasons that we're removing reforging from the game. Alternatively, they could have just removed hit chance and expertise from the game instead, and I don't think reforging would have as many problems as it once did. And Blizzard did remove those two stats, like at the same time they removed reforging, which was kind of puzzling, to say the least. Also, speaking of reforging, the yak that allows you to transmog your gear used to be a reforger before it was removed, making it a lot more useful than it is today. So useful, in fact, that most raid groups needed at least one person to have the yak to reforge quickly during raids in case someone needed to change specs or got a big upgrade. Number 2, 10-man Mythicix. It used to be that players could do the hardest content in the game with only 10 players. Again, this was only possible in Cataclysm and Myths, like Reforging. Before Cata, 10-mans were like the casual mode of raiding, and both its normal and heroic modes dropped a lower eye level gear than the 25-man versions. But for Cataclysm and Myths, both 10 and 25-man raids dropped the exact same gear. Only the 25-man would drop more gear, and the fights themselves were mostly the same. There were some differences between the 25-man and 10-man versions of boss fights, but the majority of fights were just harder on 25-man with a few exceptions. Blizzard tried their darndest to balance the two versions against each other to be equally hard, but then decided it would be easier to just balance raids around one hard mode, the 20-man Mythicix we have today. Personally, I kinda wish it was like at least a 15-man or something, because it's really hard to keep a large roster of raiders. Even at 10-man, all the guilds I've been in had trouble with keeping players, despite the groups I was in doing well. 20-man is just too much for us casual raiders who want to raid hardcore with our friends. Although flex raiding on normal and heroic is a really nice touch, I do prefer that over the old easy normal modes. Number 3. Various stats. There have been many stats removed from the game. I will only be going over stats that were added after vanilla and then removed before Legion. First up, we've got Armor Pen. Armor penetration was a surprisingly complicated stat for such a straightforward concept. Your Armor Pen rating allowed you to ignore a certain amount of your opponent's armor, which was only really useful for physical DPS classes. But the thing is, most physical DPS classes were balanced around the notion of their attacks doing less damage based on the armor of their target. So a physical DPS class with 100% armor pen did way more damage than a class that was more spell-based, all things else being equal. And some classes could hit the 100% cap with trinkets and buffs, and the way the rating calculated how much armor it would ignore was kind of complicated. 30% armor pen, for example, would not ignore 30% of the armor of all targets. The amount it ignored depended on how much armor they had, and other armor reducing debuffs on the target, to the point where you could actually only be reducing their armor by 25%, even though your rating said you had 30%. All in all, armor pen was too complicated, as it didn't always do what it said it did on its tooltip. So it was removed in Cataclysm, and was only in the game for 2 expansions, the Burning Crusade and Wrath. And then we have Spell Pen. Spell penetration was added in the Burning Crusade and worked a lot differently than Armor Pen. You see, Spell Pen was a stat designed to counter resistances. Resistances were a stat that would lower magic of a certain school by a fixed amount based on its level. Say for example, a target had 50 fire resist, and you had 50 spell penetration. Your fire attacks against that target would do 100% damage, like normal, instead of reduced amount. And because resistances were a little bit complicated as well, 50 spell resist would lower damage by way more than just 50 damage, and conversely, negative spell resistances were a thing too. If you were able to lower your target spell resistances into the negative numbers, you would do more damage to them as if they had a theoretical negative resistance stat. So 1,000 damage Shadow Bolt on a target with like negative 100 Shadow Resist would do maybe 10 times as much damage. But Blizzard didn't really like that and changed it to not work that way. And then Spell Pen was only really a PvP stat used so that CCs wouldn't be resisted. Since if you had high enough Shadow Resist, you could resist a Fear, for example, since it was in the Shadow School. Spell penetration was removed from the game in Mists of Pandaria. Surprisingly, it lasted longer than Armor Pen. Next up, we've got MP5. MP5 stood for mana per 5 seconds. This was a secondary mana regen stat like Spirit. Spirit at the time would restore mana and health by a fixed amount out of combat, and only healing and a handful of caster specs could take a talent to regen mana in combat with Spirit, and only 50% of it at max. If you didn't cast a spell for 5 seconds, your Spirit would start to regenerate mana as if you were out of combat. So some healers would actually try not to cast for 5 seconds as long as possible to get more mana back from Spirit. But MP5 was a stat that just gave you mana back every 5 seconds no matter what. No workarounds like with Spirit, so it was actually a pretty valuable mana stat, and some of the healers even preferred it to Spirit. Well, actually MP5 gave mana back every 2 seconds, not 5. I think it was only called MP5 as a reference to the 5-second rule Spirit had. MP5 was removed in Cataclysm, and they just kind of made Spirit better to compensate. I'm also pretty sure MP5 was added in the Burning Crusade, so it was only in the game for 2 expansions. Next up, we've got Expertise. This was a stat added in the Burning Crusade that acted like a second hit stat for melee classes, in that it reduced the chance a target could dodge or parry your attacks. For a short time, I think only in Miss, Blizzard made hunters need expertise as well, when they added physical ranged attacks, dodge, and parryable. But then Blizzard removed it in Warlords of Draenor because it was a super lame stat. Next up, Resilience. Resilience, added in the Burning Crusade, did different things in just about every expansion, but what it was supposed to do generally was reduce damage from players in one way or another. So it was purely a PvP defensive stat with no uses in PvE, and the reason PvP gear was generally looked down on when used by raiders, because it had this dead stat on it. Resilience was changed to PvP Resilience in Myths, and hasn't appeared on gear since. And next up we've got PvP Power. When Blizzard changed Resilience into PvP Resilience, they also added PvP Power to the game. PvP Power was supposed to be a free stat on PvP gear that would increase the damage and healing you did to players in PvP, and its stat total was not taken from the gear budget, making PvP gear with this stat actually usable in raids and stuff. And PvP Power was a pretty prized stat in PvP for the one expansion it was used, but then it stopped appearing on gear and WoD when Blizzard changed how gear works in PvP. So technically it's still in the game, it's just a dead stat now. And finally we've got Multistrike. Multistrike was added in Warlords of Draenor and then removed at the end of the expansion with the Legion pre-patch, meaning it only lasted one expansion. Multistrike was a stat that gave pretty much everything you did a chance to do a second attack or heal, only at 30% of the power of the original hit. And this second hit could crit independently of the first hit, giving you a chance to do even more damage. Pretty much every class could benefit from Multistrike, and it wasn't a complicated stat like hit or armor pen. So why was it removed? Well, because it wasn't all that different from crit. You only had a chance to multi-strike with abilities, instead of a constant increase to damage or healing like haste or mastery could provide. And Blizzard didn't think players really wanted two crit stats, so they just removed it in Legion. Number 4. Previous expansions content. Sometimes previous expansion content gets removed from the game for time-gated reasons, like Garrosh Heirlooms, Mists of Pandaria, and Warlords of Draenor legendary quests. Also, their challenge modes and challenge mode gear, Island of Thunder solo scenarios, the Battle for Undercity quest, and old raid items not having their set bonuses working anymore. Some of these things kind of make sense as to why they were removed, but there are also plenty of reasons for them to still be in the game as well. Challenge modes scale down your gear and are pretty tough to complete. I don't see why you wouldn't be able to do them in a newer expansion, other than Blizzard not wanting to have to go back and balance the dungeons around abilities you would have during the current expansions. Old set bonuses not working was to prevent OP interactions with new abilities, and having to go back and change all the previous set bonuses to work with your current character could be a pain in the ass, so it makes sense to just not let them work anymore. But it was a lot of fun to use those old set bonuses during time walking weeks, which you can't do anymore with the change. And I can't really see a reason why they would move the legendary quests or the solo scenarios. Some weird people like to grind out useless legendaries, and they don't work at max level anyway, so just why not leave them in? Number 5. A ton of useful guild perks. Guild perks are still in the game, but there used to be a lot more and better ones, like the ability to teleport your entire raid to your location, 5% of all gold you looted being duplicated and added to the guild bank, and of course the one removed recently, mass res. All healers can mass res by default now, but it was nice having DPS with the ability to mass res the raid, seeing as most of them have abilities that allow them to drop combat and survive the wipe for quick recoveries. I've gone over the guild perks that were removed in more detail in other videos, so I'll just leave it at that for now. Number 6. Marks of Honor. Now, this is actually a good thing that was removed from the game. Marks of Honor, added in the Burning Crusade, were badges you could get from Battlegrounds. You got 1 mark for a loss and 3 for a win. Most gear rewards required Honor and Marks of Honor to purchase, meaning you needed to do a variety of Battlegrounds and not just whatever one gave the most Honor. Marks of Honor are the reason Alteric Valley was changed to its current form. Before Marks of Honor, AV could last for days, since the battle didn't end until the enemy general was killed, and the battleground could be entered by people of all levels, with even things in the battleground for low-level players to help out with. With Marks of Honor though, this never-ending battleground meant Marks of Honor for AV were almost impossible to get. So they made a bunch of changes to the BG so that the match could actually end in less than an hour or so. And thus, the AV Zerg was born. Number 7. Daily Quest Hubs. The Daily Quest was added in the Burning Crusade, and even had an entire island dedicated to daily quests. Then in Myths, Blizzard removed the 25-a-day limit on daily quests and gave you more daily quests than you'd ever want to do, and made them mandatory to unlock simple vendors to actually spend your Valor points on. If you wanted to do endgame content in Myths, you needed to do a shit ton of dailies every day. And for some reason, people grew to despise daily quests because of this. Blizzard wasn't really sure why though, and just assumed people hated daily quests and hubs, so they toned it down hardcore in Warlords of Draenor, and all but removed the endgame daily quest hubs in Legion. World quests are basically the alternative to daily quest hubs, and I think are much better designed anyway. Number 8. Gold from Garrison Missions. Garrison mission tables giving gold will forever be known as the largest gold inflation in the game's history. Everyone who bothered to do this core game mechanic could make way more gold than any previous expansion allowed you to, with the minimalist amount of effort. It was so good, in fact, that Blizzard nerfed the gold from garrisons every chance they got, in just about all of Warlords of Draenor's 2 patches, before finally just taking away gold missions from the garrison and Legion. Number 9. Zone PvP. When I say Zone PvP, what I mean are battlegrounds like Wintergrass, Tolbarad, and even Ashran, I guess. Big server-wide battlegrounds that you had to queue up for to get exclusive rewards for winning. In Wintergrass and Tolbarad, you got access to daily quests and raids for your faction for winning. For Ashran, I think you got like a loot box or something. Technically, these things are still in the game, but there's not a Legion equivalent to them, so it's basically not there anymore. Number 10. Hard Mode Raid Triggers. This was a thing added in Wrath and not used very long before Blizzard added heroic difficulty as a toggle option. Hard mode triggers were a way of doing the fight that made it harder, and if you succeeded, you got better gear. One of the first ones was in a vanilla raid, I must admit. Depending on the order you killed the 3 bugs in AQ40, you got different loot, but it wasn't really used again heavily until Wrath. In the Obsidian Sanctum, for example, if you killed the boss with all 3 drakes in the room still up, you could get more loot and a mount. In Old War, almost all of the bosses had a hard mode trigger, with the Mimiron fight having one of the most famous ones of simply pressing the big red button in the room. While the idea wasn't really used after heroic and mythic modes were added to the game, hard mode triggers did return for one raid boss in Myths. In the Terrence of Endless Spring, a 4-boss raid, the first boss in the instance had a hard mode trigger, which would give you loot that was 8 item levels higher than normal, and even had an elite tag on the loot itself. And the way to trigger the hard mode was to simply kill the council boss, with the hardest of the 3 adds being killed last. Similar to how the bug trial boss had its hard mode tied to a kill order. But since then, hard mode triggers haven't really been used. Number 11. Ammo stacks of 1000. This next thing is kinda a stretch. You see, ammo for hunters has been in the game since vanilla WoW, but during the end half of Wrath of the Lich King, ammo, which for the longest time could only be stacked up to 200, was changed to stack in stacks of 1000, increasing by nearly 5 times what a hunter could carry around, making trips to cities to buy more ammo a less frequent thing. Of course, this change was only in the game for a very short time, as ammo was removed from the game in the very next expansion of Cataclysm. I just thought this was a really funny quality of life change made to an annoying class mechanic, which was made at the end of that mechanic's life cycle. Alright, and for the most part, that's it for this video. There are a few other changes I didn't go into detail about, like many class abilities added and taken away in the time period I set for this video, but I literally have a whole set of videos on this channel dedicated to that subject already.